Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 243 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have Aimee Knight.
Hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Uri Goldshtein.
Hello.
Do you want to introduce yourself, Uri?
Yes. Hi everyone. I'm Uri, and I work at the Meteor Development Group on the Apollo team. And we build tools for GraphQL, using GraphQL on the client or the server.
Oh, I didn't realize you were on the Apollo team, because I kept thinking, yeah, after we cover GraphQL, we should talk about Apollo with somebody. So we'll just wrap it all in. It'll all be good.
Yeah, we can talk about Apollo, about GraphQL. We can talk also about Meteor. We can talk about Angular.
Nice. Well, we had an episode on GraphQL quite a while ago. It was probably like 2 years ago. So do you want to kind of refresh our memories for some of us that, listened to the episode and we've kind of dabbled with it then and then maybe haven't done anything with it since then?
So in very high level, GraphQL is like a query language for your API. So basically, it's just an API specification. So you can query a different server, or from the client to the server, or from server to server, kind of like REST, right? It's kind of the equivalent of REST, but it's a query language. So instead of just calling an endpoint, you query data. So the endpoint tells you what data it can provide to you, and then you as a client just specify the actual fields that you want to get, and you get exactly those fields back. But when you say, oh, it's a query language, then people think about SQL or think about database. Here it's just an API, so you can query a server, you can query a database, you can query in any language, like whether it's Ruby, .NET, JavaScript, just like REST, basically.
Right, and if I remember right, the GraphQL query language looks a whole lot like JavaScript objects.
Yes, it's. There's more into the language than just like a JSON objects, but it's very similar to a JSON object. And the nice thing is that when you query this kind of object which has the same structure, you get back a JSON object that looks exactly like your query. So, for example, if you're like a client developer and you want to get your data in a specific structure, you can just ask for it with that structure and you get exactly that structure back. You don't need to do complicated joins on the client and handle a lot of things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that really drew me to it is visually, if you look at what you're sending in your query and you're looking at the objects you're getting back, it's very approachable, and it's, you tell it, I'm looking for, this structure from these objects, maybe with these values or values like these values, and you get that exact same structure back. You get exactly what you asked for, and you get you can get collections, you can get just one object, and it really just comes down to how you ask and what you ask for.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if people are listening right now and they're in front of a computer, I would go to just the website, like graphql.org, and you just visually look at this thing, and it's just like you said, it's visually simple. You understand exactly what's happening.
We kind of talked about it slightly, but just to kind of clarify it more, what are the problems with REST? Why was this created? For people who aren't familiar with it too.
Oh, that's a great question. Because the best way to explain about GraphQL, or one of the best ways, is actually to compare it to REST, which is probably the most common way to query an API today. So one thing is that unlike REST, where the server, let's say, I'm talking client server, but it can be any two endpoints, let's say with REST, let's say I want to query, I don't know, data, like for example, a person and its ID. So I'm querying that person with an ID, but then the server actually decides what are the fields that I'm going to get, right? Like let's say I'm calling, I'm getting the person, and the implementation on the server decides that it's going to send me the name and the age. So I get the name and the age, and then 3 days later, somebody changes something on the server, and they decide that they're going to remove the age. So I used to get the age, now I'm not getting the age anymore. Or they added a bunch of other fields, right? Like, so you always, with REST, you get, the server is dependent on what you're going to get and not the client, which the client keeps changing all the time. And also, there's kind of, with REST, you have two options, right? Like if you're build like a, let's say we're building like a really nice REST endpoints, and we get a person, and then we want the person's friends, and for each friend we want to get, I don't know, the friend's name and age again. So with REST, I have two different options, and those two different options are always those are always the problems that you'll get with REST. One option is that you'll query the friends, you'll get a list of IDs of friends, and then for each of those friends, you'll query the information from them, which means like you'll have few round trips back and forth, which is expensive. Like basically the network today is maybe the most expensive thing right now, because all the front-end frameworks and the native clients are super fast. But then you can say, okay, well, I'm a really good server developer. I can actually build a new endpoint which is specific to your client. Like you want just this, you want to get it in this structure. Okay, I'll create a new endpoint and I will send you in this structure. But then what's happening is that, first of all, now you couple the client and the server, right? Now if I want to change something on the client, I have to change the same endpoint on the server. And everything that's happening right now is that we try to separate the client from the server, like that the client developers could just keep on going, and the server developers could just develop themselves, and the integration will be easier. So I think with GraphQL, it's actually those two those two options, you get the best of them both. The server just specify, this is the schema, this is the information that I can give you. And then the client just says, I want just those fields, and I want it in this structure. Like I want, let's say, I'm building kind of like, you can imagine a JSON object where I'm querying a person, and then inside level, I'm querying his friends, and then one inside level, I'm querying just the name and the age. And first of all, it will be just one single response from the server, and also one single request for me, one single response from the server, and also I will get exactly the information that I want, not more fields, or like I have the power as the client developer. It's a lot to talk about, but there's basically those are the main differences.
Let's pause for a moment to talk about our sponsor, Taurus. Taurus is a new tool for managing and securing the secret information that allows your app to run. You know the stuff: passwords, API keys, database credentials, all the stuff that gives access to the private stuff that you don't want anybody to touch except for your application in a specific way. Taurus provides a convenient way to store all this information in the cloud, and they can't access it because it's encrypted with material derived from your password, which is never transmitted to their server. So it's secured from them, from everybody else, but accessible to you. This means only the servers, development machines, and applications you've allowed can access the information. So make secrets management headaches a thing of the past, and check out Taurus today. You can find them at devchat.tv/Taurus. That's devchat.tv/TORUS. I just want to chime in and talk about a couple of those trade-offs real quick, and then I know Aimee has another question. But I've been faced with all of those things, where as the back-end guy on Ruby, I've had people come to me and say, hey, I need this other information from that endpoint, and so then I have to go in and I have to fix it, and then they can put the change into the front end to expect it. And so where you're saying that the two are highly coupled, that's exactly true. And the other thing is that, if they needed slightly different information, I'd have to create another endpoint. And with this, they can just run ahead, and as long as they have the proper permission to get the information that they want, they can have it. And so they can move ahead, and it's only when they need something specialized or we need to change the shape of the data sum on the back end that the back-end engineers really need to get involved. And that's the payoff that I see for GraphQL as opposed to REST. But REST works great, and a lot of systems do REST by default, and so I can see why people just kind of go with that to start with, and there's nothing wrong with that approach. It's just once you start getting into some of these painful areas or these things start to become trade-offs on a regular basis, you should really have a look at GraphQL and think, okay, what if we did just have an endpoint? And the other great thing is that you can add a GraphQL endpoint to an otherwise REST system and just start having your new stuff use the GraphQL stuff, and there's almost no trade-off unless other than maintaining those REST endpoints that you have. So it's a really super cool system.
I appreciate. Oh, I was just gonna say I appreciate you bringing all that up, because I feel like I've talked to quite a few developers outside of the JavaScript community, and they just kind of turn their nose up slightly. But the JavaScript community is probably more willing to adopt newer technologies. So I appreciate all the points you're making there, Chuck.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing here about GraphQL is that, like REST, one of the huge benefits of REST is that you don't care what technology the other side is using, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with GraphQL, it's the same approach. So you can not only there's implementations for any language, if you use .NET or if you use Java or Go, but also you don't care. I'm as a client, I don't care what the other side is using. I'll just we agreed on the API and that's it. And the interesting thing about it is that also that I haven't mentioned before is that the API is typed. So there's a lot of talk recently about Flow and TypeScript and why types are super important in your code, and I completely agree. But I think when it gets to you are calling a different server or data source that you sometimes don't even have control over, you don't use types. You have no idea what you will get back, and it could break any time, and it's usually not in your control. And with GraphQL, because each field is typed, then you know exactly what you're going to get, and there's not going to be surprises when you get into this integration point and go into production, for example.
So the next question that I kind of wanted to ask about, so you talked about, GraphQL is actually a query language, but what about setting up a GraphQL server? Can you talk about what goes into that?
There's now a kind of approach that people in the GraphQL community calls GraphQL first. And that means that the first thing when you're going to start writing a GraphQL application, whether it's you start from the server or the client, you start from the schema. The schema, like we said before, it's very easy to create. You can look at it as kind of let's say, a TypeScript object definitions. So you just create a hero, and then the hero has a name and an age, and the name is a string, and the age is a number, and basically that's it. This is the schema. And then the schema also specifies the queries that you can do, get me all the heroes, or get me a specific hero, or update a hero, or delete a hero. Very simple schema. And then that schema can be, when you start writing the GraphQL server, you have few options. One, let's say the easiest option is, let's say you start from scratch. So then you just choose your language, and it can, so you pick if it's JavaScript, then you can use there's Apollo tools, GraphQL tools library, or GraphQL JS from Facebook. And the only thing you need to do is is to integrate the schema and then fulfill a thing called resolvers. Basically, that means that for each query and for each field, you can just specify a function. And the nice thing about it is that when you specify those functions, those are just functions. You can write anything you want there. So it's kind of like, let's say it's kind of like fulfilling REST endpoints, but it's more defined. So you know exactly what you need to get back, for example, a list of heroes. And the GraphQL server automatically like verifies and do validations that you actually return the things that you need. But then because it's just an arbitrary function, you can just, like, let's say if you have a database, you call your database. Let's say if you have an existing server, you can just call an existing REST endpoint, get the data back, and return it. And that's it. Or you can just like mock it, because there's a very cool library that basically, because you have everything typed, you can just very easily, without doing anything, specify the schema and then just call like a data generator library that with one line of code, you can basically create a server that will just randomly return information that looks very real, because for age, you'll get a number, and for name, you get a string. And this is just with one line of code. So writing GraphQL servers basically means that you just need to specify a schema, and then you need to just create functions however you like that answers for those functions, like return values that are very well defined, like a name of a person, or all the information of a person, or an age of a person. So yeah, and there's like libraries that help you in any language, really any language. So
yeah, I was going to say, if anything for me has changed over the last few years with regards to GraphQL, it's that there are more stable backend libraries that you can use. I mean, back when I first looked at it, because people were talking about it, you really could only set it up on Node.js using whatever Facebook had put out. And now there are a lot more options in a lot more languages. I know there's a stable implementation. They're saying they're still in beta, but there's a stable implementation in Ruby, which is my backend language of choice. And I've seen it in a lot of other systems like you're talking about. And yeah, essentially that's how you set it up, and it works great.
Yeah, and I think the important thing is that there's one point that we see a lot from like working with with customers and like users of our open source libraries, is that one thing that's happening is in the industry is that there's a shift towards a kind of like a microservice architecture, which means that you have, instead of one like monolithic server, you have a lot of microservices that can be built with a lot of different languages. And the interesting thing about GraphQL, the whole idea is that you have a schema, but because you can resolve each data point for with whatever you want to do, so each field you can resolve with a different microservice. So with a lot of people like use GraphQL actually to have it as kind of like your microservice orchestration level. Like you just start, let's say you have a monolithic server, you just put a middleware of GraphQL on top of it, just querying the existing, I don't know, REST endpoints or however you use your server is using right now. And then you can slowly just break apart. You can slowly take just even in the field level, you can just take the age of the person and call a different microservice. And GraphQL will handle all those incoming requests for you to send just one single request to the client. So this is very powerful, like the fact that you can use GraphQL on top of any language and query a lot of different microservices and migrate slowly towards that.
Yep. So one thing that I'm wondering about, I'm going to change the subject just a little bit. You said you work for the Meteor Development Group, and I know that they had their own kind of front-end to back-end coordination system that I think used WebSockets or something to do all the magic in Meteor. And And now, you work on Apollo, and there's a whole lot of movement over in the Meteor land around GraphQL. So what changed?
So this is a great question. I mean, Meteor is when Meteor started was kind of like 5 years ago. The idea was to create a new platform, right? There was a lot. The JavaScript world was really a mess back then. Like I think Bower was even like everyone was using something before Bower, Grunt. During those 5 years, a lot of things have changed. And also, Meteor realized back then that REST is just not enough for a modern client use case. And the idea of Meteor was in this network layer was to create a new protocol, also an open source protocol that can be used by any technology that's called DDP, which also supports better. It also supports better real time. It may be the main use cases like real time and RPC calls, And we wanted this protocol to be like very widespread in the community. And the fact it didn't happen. Like what's happening right now is that Meteor developers use DDP. Some, and it's good for most Meteor developers, but outside of Meteor land, not a lot of people are using DDP. And after 5 years, we started thinking, okay, then what's the thing that we're doing best? And the thing that we're doing best with Meteor is the data layer, the data integration. It's so easy and great. But then, and what changed is this 5 years? And the main thing I think that changed was that Facebook open sourced GraphQL. And when we looked at GraphQL, we said, okay, that's like very interesting. There's a lot of things in GraphQL that actually solves a lot of the problems that current Meteor users have. So, for example, the way, like with Meteor, it's kind of like awkward today to query other databases. And in GraphQL, you can query whatever data source you want. So instead of now shifting all of Meteor into GraphQL, we said, okay, let's do it different than how we did Meteor. Instead of building this huge thing, let's just start with the data layer, and let's focus on something that is very powerful, and this is GraphQL. So basically, Apollo is a separate project, separate library that is very different from Meteor. It's not. You can use it with any technology. Again, like any technology, and you don't need like a complete platform like Meteor. And we see it also as kind of like the future data layer for Meteor. And I'll just add one small sentence into that is that Meteor was really good at real time. It's also important to say that GraphQL supports real time with few different options. I won't expand too much right now, but you can use today GraphQL subscriptions and get real time or like push updates from the server into your client. Yeah.
So, oh, sorry, I'm still dragging Chuck. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between Relay and Apollo? And I feel like majority of people using GraphQL are using Relay. So how does that fit into everything?
Yeah, Facebook built it. Why are you building it too?
So basically, Facebook released also Relay, which is a library that is used in very specific parts of in the Facebook company. It's not used in Facebook.com. And Relay is a great product. Like we got a lot of inspiration from that, but also Relay had got a lot of things. Maybe because it was like very early, it got a lot of things not as good as it could have been. So we said, okay, let's try. We've done the Meteor data layer for a while, for 5 years, and we learned a lot from it. Let's try to do the same ourselves. And when we started doing it, and see how it goes, what we are coming up with, and what we came up with was actually a library that is much simpler than Relay. Like Relay is, I don't know if you know, but the main, I think, feedback that people get on Relay is that it's very hard to start. This is one thing. The second thing, it only works with React, like other client-side developers, if they use Angular or Ember or Vue.js, they can't use Relay. And also Relay, actually, which is weird, but Relay doesn't support the GraphQL spec as is. So you have to do like specific modifications to the GraphQL spec in order to work with Relay, to use pagination and all kinds of things in there. Apollo uses GraphQL as is. Like, you don't need to change. There's a lot of tutorials that explain to you GraphQL and then explain Relay, because they say, okay, now in order to support Relay, you also need to do other things. There's no Apollo there because there's nothing to do. If you write GraphQL, you write Apollo. There's nothing you need to change in your implementation or how you write your schema. Now, it's interesting that you said that most people use Relay. It was like that when we started. But I know it's not the best metric, but it's the only metric that we have, and this is NPM downloads. And we just recently, this month, passed Relay with Apollo client. So this, like, the thing of Relay being more popular has actually shifted. And it's not true anymore. Also, one of the things that Relay also understood that, like, we work a lot with Relay and we talk with them, and like we have conversations with the teams at Facebook, the different teams at Facebook, like weekly. And Relay understood the things what they did like wrong or what they can do better. So they're actually working now on Relay 2.0. The thing is that nobody knows when it's going to be out. And they're like developing it in closed source. They're not like showing people what they're actually doing there. And when they talk about it in talks, you can see that the things that they improved in Relay from Relay 1 to, or want to improve from Relay 1 to Relay 2, whenever it's going to be out, is things that are already existing and happening in Apollo client, like static queries and all of kinds of stuff like that. So, but I think so. In my opinion, like, it doesn't really matter. Like, the more clients there are out there, the better. I think the GraphQL movement is so big right now, and it brings with it so many like improvements that the client is like the smallest thing you should care about. Like, you should just try it out. I think the best thing is just to write like a very simple, take an hour or two, write a simple app in Apollo, write a simple app in Relay, and compare. But
yeah, I think that's really the thing for me is, it's like, well, do I have to pick a side? No. Does it solve my problems? I mean, that's a side I'm going to pick. And, in some cases, Relay's probably great, and in some cases, there's probably a trade-off the other way. But the thing is that I generally, on my front end, I'm working in Angular. And so if I can't use Relay, then I'm going to use Apollo. And if I'm in Ember or Vue or something like that, then I'm going to use Apollo. And the fact that there's something out there that does things nicely, if Facebook wants to own that space, then they have to earn it. And that's the nice thing about open source in general, is that if something doesn't solve somebody's problem, then somebody else can come along and solve that problem. And if whoever originally solved the problem feels like they want to own that turf, then they've got to step up. And if they're happy with, look, we solved these sets of problems and we do a great job of it, and we're going to focus there, then that's great too. And so, yeah, it's, I don't see it as a competition between Apollo and Relay so much as just, what solves your problems? What makes you happy to code in and do that.
Let's take a break from this episode and really quickly talk about finding a job. Searching for a job can feel stressful, scary, and time-consuming. Pushy recruiters try to sell you on roles you don't actually want, and the job boards make you feel like you're throwing your resume into a black hole, never to be seen again. And sometimes you go all the way through an interview process just to find out at the very end that the salary offer or company culture doesn't match what you're looking for. Well, there's a solution. Hired.com is the world's most intelligent talent matching platform for full-time and contract opportunities. They make the job search faster, focused, and stress-free instead of endlessly applying to companies and hoping for the best. Hired puts you in control of how and when you connect with compelling opportunities. And after completing one simple application, top employers apply to you. And the best part is that you get money. That's right. They pay you if you get a job through them. Listeners to this show can earn double their normal hiring bonus by signing up with the show's link. That's right, you get $2,000 instead of $1,000. So go sign up at hired.com/JavaScriptJabber.
The truth is there's really non-competition. Like, we talk weekly, we share, they're coming to our meetups and giving talks, and we like, they know exactly what we're doing. Like, we're completely open, like, to the Facebook teams. Like, they know exactly what we're doing and what we're working on. And we just, like, recently did the GraphQL Summit. Was the first GraphQL conference, and we had 2 talks from Facebook there. So we're working. Basically, we're working together.
So how do you test GraphQL?
This is a great question. So depends on what side do you want to test it. The thing is that, let's say I'll start maybe with the client side. So on the client side, the good thing, again, is that you have a typed API. So even before you start testing, when you have your schema, you get immediately in your IDE, whatever IDE you use, there's a lot of plugins for GraphQL, you get auto-completion and validation. So for example, if you wrote and this is in real time while you're developing, right? Like, let's say you start writing a query and you wrote it wrong. Then you'll get an error before even you finished your sentence. So at least even if before you started testing and you don't want to invest time in testing, or you just want to hack something, you know that you're going to write the API exactly like the schema specifies. But then the interesting thing is that because it's a typed API, you can actually write a very simple, and if you go to GraphQL tool, if you Google GraphQL tools, then you can see there's a function there that you give it the schema, and it basically starts like a mocking server for you, and it returns like auto-generated code from the schema, which looks exactly like you would expect. And you can expand it more and more, but this is so it means that if you don't, let's say you're a client developer, and what usually happens, and you build your client and then you wait, like, I don't know how long to the server developers to finish their things, you can actually start like a mocking server with 1 line of code and get everything you want from the server. Like, you have a working server running. And when the server will finish development, it will send you the data exactly the same because it's based on the schema. So testing your client side is really easy. There's another also possibility, actually, which I'm doing now because I'm doing a PR for Angular.io, the website, is to run GraphQL server on the client, on the browser. And then you actually run the resolvers and everything I've said now on your in-memory browser. And that means that if you run unit tests on your client, you can actually really query kind of like your GraphQL server, just it sits on the client and you can run those tests immediately. And on the server, basically, again, it's the same thing as writing let's say if we were talking about Node, you use the same tools as Node servers, but because of the schema, you know better, you know exactly what you're going to get from the client, and your resolvers are also you need to test just the specific resolvers that you're doing. You don't need to now, I don't know, let's say in REST endpoint, you can get something from the REST endpoint. You don't know exactly what you're going to get. Maybe the client did a mistake, sent more I don't know, params than it could. The GraphQL runtime actually prevents that, absorbs that for you. So instead of now testing a lot of like different scenarios that the client can like do, the GraphQL runtime actually like cleans it up for you, and when you actually test your resolvers, you know exactly what you're gonna get. So it's very easy to test as specific units of resolvers.
All right, you had me on everything there except for how in the heck do you run the GraphQL server in the browser? That just sounds cool.
So I think I wanted like to finish that PR before this show, so I could actually send it. People could go ahead and look at it. But I basically, if there's Angular developers out there, then I basically took the Tour of Heroes tutorial, which is the main tutorial on Angular I/O, and in that tutorial, they're running an in-memory REST endpoint. So I basically did the same.
Oh, okay.
Just with GraphQL. The hard thing for me was actually to make that GraphQL server, and I used like Apollo GraphQL tools, the library from Apollo, which, because it's Node and JavaScript, it works both on the client and on the server. But the hard thing for me was actually to compile the GraphQL tools through AOT compiler of Angular and through Rollup.
Yes.
Very, very hard, but I'm happy to say that like today I've solved this thing. So finally, so the PR is coming soon.
Well, look forward to it. So do you have any success stories with GraphQL? Because it's one thing to hear all the theoretical, hey, use GraphQL because it'll make your life better and you'll have unicorns in your office and it'll be wonderful. But it's another thing to hear about a company that, switched over from REST or, somehow implemented GraphQL on their system, on a new system or an existing system, and found some benefits. Do you have stories like that you can share with us?
Yeah. So, I mean, the best story, I think, is actually from Facebook, like the Facebook story and why they created GraphQL. And how GraphQL started basically is that in 2011, like Facebook had to, they had like, maybe now nobody remembers Google Plus, but back then it was like a real threat on Facebook. And Facebook had to, come up with like mobile apps, like normal working mobile apps really fast. The problem is that there were a few problems, but one of the main problem was that they had an existing servers that worked with like very old APIs. So what they needed to do is actually they didn't have time to rewrite the servers, right? They need to get out those like those clients, the new APIs really fast, and that's when they invented GraphQL. So basically they used GraphQL in order to use their existing old infrastructure, but to mirror that and to actually make a normal modern API for the clients. And like everyone knows that now, the Facebook first native mobile app was like a huge success, and the rest is history. But I think for me, actually coming from like the Node world and from like Meteor, it's a great lesson because it means that now, like when you come to you work in a company with existing infrastructure and you want to modernize that infrastructure, the first thing you say is like, okay, let's rewrite everything, right? Like we have an old, I don't know, IBM WebSpheres, or we have, I don't know, like an old Java backend or whatever. And I think this is what GraphQL is showing us is actually, it's a new technology, but it basically says, no, you have an existing data provider. You have an existing server that exists and works. Don't change it. Put GraphQL on top of it, and then if you want later on, you can change it, but there's no reason to. Like you have the ability to use your existing assets and move fast, build new apps, build new things. So I think the story of how Facebook came to be is a very interesting story that shows the real power of GraphQL. Like if you're, I know you're a developer for a bank, and you have, I don't know, existing mainframes and really old like IBM WebSpheres and things like that, and you don't have the money or the time to rewrite those. Like GraphQL is, I think, the best solution to to put in there in order to modernize your business, for example, without rewriting everything. And I think this is why also you see like a lot of companies that are not just like startup companies that started from new, but like existing companies doing that transition. And the second maybe best story or use case is GitHub, right? Like GitHub is like they're using GraphQL internally, and just recently they announced that actually all of their public API is also going to be GraphQL. Like they're still going to support REST, but it's going to be GraphQL. So it looks like, and there's like a huge list in, I don't know, GraphQL.org, for example, of like financial institutions and like a lot of companies that, for me, the best and the most interesting thing to see there is it's not just like cool startups or like cool like products that use, like the newest technologies. It's existing businesses that were able to, use new front-end technologies, for example, or to use new APIs and stay with their existing data infrastructure.
It was my understanding from reading an article about it that like GitHub did that in part so that they could have the same API for the public and private information, and they wouldn't have to maintain two separate ones anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the GitHub story is that they used it internally because it was good for them, and then they say, well, it's good for us, then why should we, why can't it be good for other developers? And I think actually that transition from GitHub is great because now anyone like querying GitHub is probably, there's most tutorials out there probably for developers is querying, the GitHub API. And I think the best thing you could do is actually compare. Go to the GitHub REST API and GitHub GraphQL API and just start hacking. And I think that's the best example out there for you instantly you get the difference. You don't need to read the documentation, you don't need to do anything, you just pop up like a graphical editor and start hacking around and you'll query that information. So I think the GitHub like story is amazing. Like it was good for them internally, but then also there was a lot of questions in the like debate inside the GraphQL ecosystem. Like, is GraphQL also good for public APIs? Like, it's definitely good for internal APIs, but when we want to expose like APIs for third-party libraries, is that good? And I think GitHub pushed the envelope there a lot. There's a great talk in GraphQL Summit from one of the GitHub engineers about it. Like, GitHub did a really amazing job.
Well, and the thing that gets me excited about that is that most of the time when somebody says, oh, go try out this new kind of API, and they point me to some like Star Wars database or something, right? And it's like, okay, but the data's not very deep and the results really aren't that interesting. And then, if GitHub's going to do it, then it's like, oh, well, I kind of know what all the stuff is there, and I can build myself a little app with data that I actually care about that's a real world, real business application that I can test against.
Exactly. And I think, like we created, most of our examples in Apollo, if you just go to the website, then they're based on, do you have an example that's called Git Hunt? It's kind of like, product hunt for GitHub repositories. But the interesting thing here is that you query, you have one schema, but parts of those schema query the GitHub API, and parts of those schema are querying your own database. And for the client, it's like the same schema. So the fact that we were able to, to query GitHub with their GraphQL API, like really inspired us, and I think, did great for the community. Like it's when GitHub turns into started to use a solution that you use, it's always good. It's yeah.
Cool. Well, let's go ahead and move into picks. Before we do that, though, is there a place where people can follow up on this stuff or check out what you're working on?
Yeah. So I think the best thing, I don't know if everyone who used to check out GraphQL a few months ago or a year ago, and just Googled around. Now there's a new website for GraphQL.org. It's a new website. It's really, really impressive, and there's basically everything there. And the other thing that I think I would recommend to check out is ApolloData.com. It's we have there all of the tools that you can, if you want to actually start writing tools, clients, or servers, you can actually start writing there. There's tutorials and everything you need. So it's ApolloData.com.
This episode is sponsored by Front-End Masters. Engineers have watched over 2 million hours of Front-End Masters videos to upgrade their skills in the latest best practices in front-end development and Node.js. Popular video courses of theirs include courses on Advanced JavaScript, Angular 2, React, API design with Node, and functional and asynchronous JavaScript. Many of their teachers have even been guests on JavaScript Jabber. Check them out at frontendmasters.com.
All right, well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Aimee, do you have some picks for us?
I do. So the first one is something that I believe I found. I don't know. I found it this weekend. I haven't had a chance to dig into it yet, but it looks pretty good. And a couple of people tweeted at me that they already did look into it. It was really good. But it's Crypto 101. So I don't know. This is something that I haven't really dug into very much, and it looks very approachable. So that is going to be my pick for this week. I had another one ready, but you called on me so soon, and I can't find the link. So I guess I will save it for next week, and this will be my only one for this week.
You can share it, and I can find the link.
So I'm just going to save it for next week.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to jump in here with a couple of picks. The first one is I went with my wife, and we saw Rogue One, which is the new Star Wars movie. And it was good. It was a good movie. I don't know, episode 4, episode 5, and episode 6, I watched those growing up, and I kind of have these moments of nostalgia watching them, I guess. But anyway, I really did enjoy the movie. It's just not, it's not the same for me, I guess. But yeah, anyway, I did enjoy the movie. I thought it was a well put together movie. So I'm going to pick that. And then I found a link. I didn't find a link. Somebody sent me a link. One of our listeners from Adventures in Angular, because we razz Ward Bell about Star Wars. And it's the power consumption for the Death Star and how much it would cost to power the Death Star. And it was really, really interesting. So anyway, if you're interested in that, I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And yeah, those are my picks. Uri, what are your picks?
So I have one pick. I follow everything that Tim Ferriss is doing. I don't know. It's for those of you who doesn't know, Tim Ferriss is the person that wrote the 4-Hour Walk Week book, which I think is amazing. It's basically a way to, in my mind, how do you work without wasting your time on stuff that you don't want to waste time on, doing the exact minimum and the most important things in order to get everything done. So it's very, very interesting. And he just released a new book. It's called Tools of Titans. And I just started reading 2 chapters of it, and it's really amazing. So I think everyone should read that. It's a really good book.
That one's getting a lot of recommendations in my circles, so I'll have to check it out.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, Uri. This was a lot of fun, and I think it was nice to get a little bit deeper, I think, on GraphQL than we got last time. So,
yeah, thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure.
All right, well, we'll wrap this one up, and we'll catch you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Hope you feel better, Chuck.
Me too.